Usually when we talk about personal growth or expanding our consciousness, there is this expectation that it's going to feel like a peaceful sunrise.
Right, like this very gentle awakening.
Exactly. You read the right texts, you meditate, you do the inner work, and slowly, gently, the light just sort of spreads over the horizon. Everything gets warmer, clearer, and, easier.
Which is such a comforting thought.
It is. We have this culturally ingrained idea that becoming a more self-aware human being is a gentle, linear process of blossoming. But then you step into the world of depth psychology and certain ancient mythic traditions, and suddenly that beautiful sunrise metaphor is completely shattered.
Oh, totally shattered. It's not a sunrise at all.
No, we are looking at a landscape of inner growth that is, honestly, violent. It's disruptive. It's messy.
It is the absolute definition of a psychological rupture. We like the idea of growth as a comfortable accumulation of wisdom, a sort of spiritual retirement account we pay into.
A spiritual 401k.
Yeah, exactly. But the reality, as we were exploring today with you through this extraordinary essay from the Tao of Fred titled Conscience and Consciousness, is that true consciousness doesn't bloom, it bites.
It bites. I love that phrasing.
It actively tears away the fabric of what you thought was your stable reality.
And that tension is exactly where we are planting our flag for this deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. You, our listener, are stepping into a profound collision between the clinical depth psychology of Eric Neumann and the deeply spiritual, mythic traditions of human history.
So we're talking alchemy, theology, and the oldest narratives humanity has passed down.
Right. We're walking a very fine line between the scholarly and the spiritual today, and we are operating on the premise that you are already familiar with the broad strokes of Jungian thought and mythological archetypes, so we aren't going to get bogged down in basic definitions.
We can jump right into the good stuff.
Exactly. We are going straight for the throat of this essay's central thesis, which is that the birth of conscience is not a societal imposition, but a devastating psychic event.
A literal event in the mind.
Right. And to understand that rupture, we have to establish exactly what state of being we are violently tearing ourselves away from. What are we rupturing from?
Well, Eric Neumann's work, particularly his book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, gives us the foundational architecture here.
Right.
Neumann argues that our modern expectation of smooth psychological unfolding is a complete illusion. It's a modern luxury.
It's a fantasy we've sold ourselves.
Exactly. The emergence of the ego-like, the actual birth of the individual self out of the collective human background, is characterized by conflict, pain, and a sudden jarring awareness of responsibility. The early psyche exists in a state of undifferentiated unity.
Meaning there's no me and you.
Right, there's absolutely no separation between the self and the world.
He uses the Ouroboros, right? The serpent swallowing its own tail.
Yes, and what's fascinating here is why that specific symbol is so enduring across cultures. The Ouroboros is the ultimate representation of preconscious wholeness. It is a closed loop.
It's self-contained.
Totally self-contained. The serpent bites its own tail, and in doing so, it creates a perfect self-sustaining circle. In this Euroboric state of the early psyche, there is no moral tension. There is no reflection.
Because there's nothing to reflect on, it's just one thing.
Precisely. You are completely whole, but you are whole in the exact same way that a person in a deep, dreamless sleep is whole. The Ouroboros is entirely complete, but it is completely unaware of its own completeness. It simply exists.
It makes me think of floating in a sensory deprivation tank. If you've ever been in one, you know the feeling.
Oh yeah, the float tanks.
Right. The water is the exact temperature of your skin. It's pitch black. It's totally silent. After 45 minutes, your brain loses the physiological ability to distinguish where your body ends and the water begins.
You dissolve.
You completely dissolve. You feel completely blissfully at one with your environment. But here's the catch. You can't actually do anything in there.
No, you're just suspended.
Right. You can't engage with the world. You can't make a moral choice. You can't truly know yourself as a distinct individual until you open that heavy, salt-encrusted door and step out into the freezing air of reality.
That's a great way to put it.
The tank is perfectly safe, perfectly whole, and perfectly unconscious.
I like the tank analogy, but we have to push it one step further to really capture Neumann's point.
Okay, push it.
When you enter a sensory deprivation tank, there is still an I experiencing the lack of sensation. You are aware that you are floating.
Ah, right. You know you're in a tank.
Exactly. In the true Euroboric state, there isn't even an I to experience the floating. The knower and the known are the exact same thing. Stepping out of that tank and feeling the freezing air, that shock to the biological system, that maps perfectly onto the birth of conscience.
That initial shocking realization.
Right, we tend to think of conscience as a socially constructed rule book,
Hmm.
a list of moral mandates handed down by a community to keep us civilized.
Like, don't steal, don't lie, wash your hands.
Yeah, just basic rules of the road. But the essay argues something far more terrifying. Conscience is an internal psychic event.
It's the moment the human being stops simply being and begins to judge its own being. It's the division of the self into the actor and the observer.
It is the dividing line of human experience. The birth of the ego requires a violent break from that Euroboric unity. And when that break happens, it is experienced primarily as pain.
Because it's tearing you out of the tank.
Exactly. It is the sudden, crushing weight of realizing that you are separate, that your actions have distinct consequences, and that you alone are responsible for those actions. That is a transition from the closed loop of the Ouroboros to the open spiral of awareness.
The spiral, right, so we're not just going in circles anymore.
No, we're moving. The serpent in the Ouroboros bites its own tail in comfort. But the bite of conscience introduces a totally different kind of return. Conscience bites in pain.
And that returning bite brings us to the concept of remorse, which the essay argues is the actual mechanism that keeps us from just crawling right back into that psychological sensory deprivation tank.
Which is exactly what we want to do. We want to go back to sleep.
Of course we do. The air is freezing. If conscience is the rupture that wakes us up, remorse is the biological alarm clock that refuses to let us fall back asleep.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it.
The etymology the author pulls in here is stunning. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting.
It reveals the somatic truth of the experience. The English word remorse comes from the Latin remorter. Re meaning again, and mortar meaning to bite.
To bite again.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Remorse literally, structurally, means to bite again. It is not a passive state of regret. It is an active, recurring internal laceration.
The essay leans on James Joyce to illustrate this, specifically from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Joyce revived this incredibly visceral medieval phrase, "Agen bite of inwit."
Such a strange, powerful phrase.
The biting again of inner understanding. When you hear that phrase, "Agen bite of inwit," you don't just process it intellectually, you feel it in your gut.
It's a very physical grouping of words.
It is. Stephen Dedalus isn't sitting in a parlor rationally contemplating his moral ledger, making a pros and cons list of his sins. He is physically, viscerally gnawed by his own self-awareness.
And the necessity of that repetition, though again in the biting again, is the core engine of psychological growth.
Why does it have to happen again, though? Why isn't once enough?
Because a single wound, a single shock to the system, is easily dismissed. The human psyche has a terrifyingly efficient immune response to single puncture wounds. We scab over them, rationalize them, and pretend they never happened.
We rewrite history.
Constantly. We rewrite the history to favor our own innocence.
Yeah.
We tell ourselves, oh, it wasn't my fault, circumstances were weird.
Right.
But a wound that returns, a bite that happens again and again, defies that immune response. It creates an indelible memory. It forces the individual to look backward at the cause and forward at the implication.
It demands a narrative.
Exactly. In short, the returning bite of remorse creates a continuous timeline. It creates interiority.
Okay, I have to challenge this model, though. Because when we talk about a wound that constantly reopens, a guilt that bites again and again, isn't that just a blueprint for crippling neurosis?
This is a valid question.
I mean, we all know people, or maybe we've been that person, who are so paralyzed by past mistakes that they just can't function. Doesn't getting bitten again and again by your own inner understanding just lock you in a different kind of prison? How does the psyche survive that perpetual vulnerability without completely collapsing inward?
That is the essential razor's edge the essay walks, and it's why we have to distinguish between a closed loop and an open spiral.
Okay, break that down for me.
If you are paralyzed by guilt, endlessly ruminating on your failure without any shift in your behavior or your relation to the world, you haven't escaped the Ouroboros at all. You've just created a new, slightly more miserable closed loop.
You're just a sad snake eating its own tail now.
Exactly. You are sealed in a regression, using guilt as a defense mechanism to avoid the hard work of actual transformation. It's a way of staying stuck so you don't have to change.
Oh, wow. Using guilt to avoid change. That's uncomfortable.
It's very common. But the true experience of remorse, as Moyman in this essay frame it, operates as an open spiral. The capacity to feel that returning wound isn't a design flaw or a weakness. It is the specific feature that keeps the psyche permeable.
It keeps the door open.
Right. It prevents the self from sealing itself off in sociopathic unconsciousness. The self that cannot feel remorse isn't liberated, it is entombed. It has returned to the snake eating its own tail, circling endlessly without ever truly encountering the reality of the other.
So remorse forces the circle to stay open. It prevents the scab from fully forming over the ego. Every time it bites, it pushes you a fraction further along the path, preventing you from slipping back into the infantile fantasy that your actions don't have weight.
It sustains the exact, precise tension required for consciousness to deepen. Without that tension, the psychological gravity of the Ouroboros would pull us all back into the path of least resistance.
So if remorse keeps the wound open, what actually happens inside that newly exposed space?
This is where we get into the alchemy.
Right. The essay introduces this concept of the alchemy of the wound, which revolves around the paradox of aperture. It suggests that the very thing that injures the ego is the exact mechanism that opens it to anything larger than itself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can look at this through the lens of the nigredo, which is the initial stage in the alchemical opus.
Just to quickly contextualize for the listener, alchemy isn't just medieval guys trying to turn lead into gold.
No, we understand that alchemy is a psychological projection. It's a mapping of the soul's transformation onto chemical processes. Jung was huge on this.
Right.
The nigredo is the blackening. It is the absolute, unmitigated decomposition of the ego's established structures. It is the rotting away of certainty.
It's the terrifying realization that the justifications you've built your entire identity upon are completely hollow.
Yes. The stable architecture of who you thought you were completely collapses. Your comfortable identity fragments. But the text reinforces that this decomposition is the mandatory precondition for any real transformation.
You have to rot to grow.
A closed psyche is perfectly intact, yes, but it is completely sealed off from any higher truth or deeper connection. It is an impenetrable fortress. A wounded psyche is compromised, hurting, and vulnerable. But because it is compromised, it is finally permeable.
The walls are breached.
Exactly. The collapse of the ego is the hole through which the true self, capital S self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, can finally enter.
Think of a seed. A seed in its dormant state is flawless. It has a hard, perfect shell. It is completely self-contained and seemingly immortal as long as it stays on the shelf.
Right. It can sit there for years.
But if that seed is going to fulfill its actual nature and become a tree, its perfection has to be violently destroyed. The shell has to crack. It has to be subjected to the dark, damp, rotting environment of the soil.
That's the nigredo,
Yeah,
the soil.
exactly. The destruction of the seed's structural integrity is the birth of the root system. But the essay makes a highly specific point here, a crucial nuance. This aperture isn't just about cultivating a vague, receptive mindset.
No, not at all.
You don't achieve this permeability just by deciding to be a more open-minded person on a Tuesday.
You cannot meditate your way into the nigredo. You
No.
can't just journal it into existence.
So how does it happen?
The aperture is produced by a very particular, agonizing encounter with one's own shadow. It is the encounter with your own failure, your own complicity in the suffering of the world.
Complicity, that's a heavy word.
It is. The wound of conscience we are talking about is not a trauma inflicted on you by external forces. Those are valid, of course, but they are a different psychological category. The wound of conscience is self-knowledge that has suddenly become unbearable. It is looking in the mirror and realizing you are the architect of the wasteland.
Unbearable self-knowledge.
It becomes unbearable. The ego violently rejects it. It fights it tooth and nail. But then, as you sit with the age and bite of inwit, as the remorse bites and bites again without you fleeing from it, the ego's defenses exhaust themselves.
You stop fighting the realization.
Right. And the unbearable slowly becomes bearable. And eventually it becomes illuminating. The wound is no longer opposed to your wholeness. It is the very conduit through which a mature wholeness becomes possible.
This pattern wounding as the exact mechanism of awakening is so intense, and it's woven into the absolute bedrock of human storytelling.
It's everywhere once you know to look for it.
Right. We didn't just discover this in 20th century clinical practice. Human beings have been encoding this agonizing process into our oldest myths for millennia. The essay proves this by taking us through 4 distinct mythic mirrors. And the first one, the ultimate narrative of unbearable self-knowledge, is Oedipus.
Oedipus is the perfect starting point because Sophocles built the entire tragedy around the structural paradox of sight and blindness.
Which is such a brilliant motif.
It is. Oedipus, as the king of Thebes, operates under the illusion of supreme, rational sight. He believes his intellect is flawless because he solved the riddle of the Sphinx.
He's the smartest guy in the room.
Exactly. He sees the physical world clearly, but he is utterly blind to his own interior reality. He is completely blind to the reality that he is the source of the plague, the murderer of his father, the defiler of his mother's bed.
And the structural irony is established the second Tiresias steps onto the stage. Tiresias is the blind seer. He is physically devoid of sight, yet he possesses the total truth of the cosmos.
He knows everything.
He holds the knowledge that the seeing king cannot bear to receive. You have the seer with no eyes who knows everything, and the king with perfect vision who knows absolutely nothing.
Blindness, in this mythological framework, is the mandatory precondition for inner vision. The entire movement of the play is the brutal transition from superficial sight to devastating insight, purchased entirely through darkness.
So when the truth is finally revealed to Oedipus,
The realization is, as we defined it, unbearable. But the crucial moment is his reaction. He doesn't repress it. He doesn't launch a PR campaign to justify his actions based on his
I
ignorance.
didn't know they were my parents. It's not my fault.
Exactly. He could have played that card. He could have said, the gods tricked me. But he acts on the recognition in a catastrophic, irreversible way. He takes the brooches from his dead mother's dress and blinds himself.
Usually we read that blinding as a horrific, almost reflexive punishment, a man who simply cannot stomach the visual world anymore after what he's done. But applying Newman's framework, we have to look deeper.
We have to see it as a psychological maneuver.
Right. The self-inflicted blindness is a profound psychological transformation. He is taking that internal, unbearable wound of conscience, the guilt that is tearing him apart, and he is making it permanent, visible, and external. He is structurally matching his physical reality to his psychic reality.
He is embodying the Negredo. And the proof that this is a transformation rather than just a punishment is found in the sequel, Oedipus at Colonus.
Which people often skip over.
They do, but it's so important. Years later, Oedipus is a broken, blinded exile, led around by his daughter. But he is not a pathetic figure. His suffering has deepened him.
He's changed fundamentally.
He has acquired a strange, terrifying, sacred authority. By the end of his life, his very presence is considered a profound blessing to the land. The kings of Greece compete for the right to bury him because his bones are viewed as holy talismans that will protect their city-states.
The wound of conscience destroyed the arrogant king, but it forged a man capable of a totally different, divine kind of sight.
The catastrophe of conscience becomes illuminating.
The catastrophe of conscience is the genesis of genuine spiritual authority. That flips our entire cultural understanding of what makes a leader. But so, what does this all mean for the rest of us? The essay shifts gears from a king wounded by knowledge he was forced to uncover to a woman wounded by knowledge she actively, deliberately pursued. We have to look at the myth of Psyche from Apuleius' The Golden Ass.
Psyche is a mortal woman taken to a hidden magical palace to be the bride of the god Eros. But the arrangement hinges on one absolute unbreakable law.
Don't.
Right. She is forbidden from ever looking at her husband. He only visits her in the pitch black of night. So she lives in the state of perfect, unconscious comfort. She's provided with warmth, endless wealth, safety, and a divine partner, but it is entirely a blind existence.
It is the Ouroboros. It's the sensory deprivation tank again. She is completely comfortable, completely catered to, but completely unseeing. She has no agency.
None at all.
But eventually, driven by the psychological pressure of her sisters and the raw, inescapable human drive for consciousness, she breaks the rule. She waits until Eros is asleep, she takes a knife, and she lights an oil lamp.
The lighting of that lamp is the mythological representation of the first act of conscience. It is the ego's refusal to remain in the dark. It is the moment the self decides it must know the objective reality of its situation, rather than resting safely in an unexamined infantile paradise.
But the light carries a devastating tax. As she holds the lamp, overwhelmed by the breathtaking reality of the god lying next to her, her hand trembles. A single drop of scalding oil falls from the lamp and sears Eris's shoulder.
It's the cost of the light.
Yes. He wakes up, feels the burn, registers the betrayal of the broken rule, and immediately flees. In a fraction of a second, Psyche loses the god, the palace, and her perfect safety. The essay equates that drop of burning oil directly to remorse. It is the inevitable, painful cost of achieving light.
And Norman's interpretation of this moment is vital. A superficial reading treats Psyche's curiosity as a tragic flaw-like. If she had just followed the rules, she could have been happy forever.
Just stay in the dark, Psyche.
Right. But Newman argues the exact opposite. Her fall was a psychological necessity. Yes, the unconscious wholeness she experienced with Eros was real, but it was entirely infantile. It was a state of blind maternal dependence. You cannot have a conscious, mature relationship with a being you refuse to look at.
Her wound is her drive for truth, and the price of that truth is her exile from comfort. But look at her response. She doesn't just sit in the dirt mourning her lost
She
paradise.
doesn't give up.
She accepts the exile and undertakes a series of agonizing, seemingly impossible trials mandated by Aphrodite, sorting a mountain of mixed grains, retrieving golden fleece from violent rams, descending into the underworld itself. And through the brutal labor of those trials, she actually earns her immortality.
She transmutes her mortal dependence into divine equality.
Exactly. She earns the right to stand beside Eros in the full light of Olympus. The drop of oil burned away the Ouroboros and forced her to forge a self capable of holding a conscious relationship with the divine.
Oedipus and Psyche demonstrate the agonizing, deeply personal cost of seeking the truth. They show what happens when the ego allows the light in. But the essay masterfully pivots to the other side of the equation.
Right, because there's a flip side.
There is. The next two myths demonstrate the devastating systemic consequences of ignoring the truth, of refusing to look. And that begins with the Arthurian legend of the Fisher King.
The Fisher King is a monarch who has suffered a terrible unhealing wound. He was struck by a spear, often portrayed as a cursed lance through the thighs, or in the older, more visceral versions of the myth, directly through the genitals.
A wound to his generative power.
Yes, because of this specific wound, he is suspended in a state of living death. He cannot die, but he cannot heal. He is emasculated, unable to ride, fight, or govern. He just sits in his boat near his castle, fishing, waiting.
The central tragedy of the Grail legend is that the king's physical wound is inextricably linked to the metaphysical health of the land itself. Because the king's generative power is incapacitated, the entire realm suffers a sympathetic necrosis.
The land dies with the king.
Exactly. The rivers dry up, the crops fail, the livestock cease to reproduce, and the kingdom becomes the wasteland. It is a profound metaphor for systemic failure. An entire ecosystem is dying because of one central, unhealed, unaddressed wound at the top of the hierarchy.
And into this dying wasteland rides Parsifal, a young, incredibly naive knight. He wanders into the Grail castle and is invited to a feast. During the meal, he witnesses a bizarre, mournful procession. He sees the bleeding lance, he sees the Grail itself, and most importantly, he sees the king suffering in agony on his litter.
It's all right in front of him.
Right there. Every natural human instinct in Parsifal is screaming at him to ask the basic question of empathy. What happened to you? What ails you? But he doesn't. He actively suppresses the impulse. He bites his tongue.
And why does he bite his tongue? Because before he began his quest, he was mentored by an older knight who gave him a crash course in the rules of chivalry. And the primary directive of that social conditioning was, a true knight does not ask unnecessary prying questions.
It's impolite.
It breaches protocol.
Mm-hmm.
So Parsifal watches this man suffer, he watches the mystical ritual of the Grail play out, and he remains perfectly, horrifically polite. He follows the social script, he goes to sleep, and when he wakes up, the castle has vanished. He missed the moment, and the wasteland continues to rot.
I have to say, this is where the myth bridges thousands of years to punch us right in the chest today. Parsifal's failure is not a failure of physical courage. He didn't flee from a dragon. He failed in the most mundane, terrifyingly relatable way possible. A failure of presence.
A failure to engage with what's real.
Exactly. He filtered his raw, intuitive humanity through a socially constructed artificial rulebook. How often do we do exactly that?
Oh, all the time. Daily.
We see someone suffering, a family member, a colleague, or even a systemic injustice in our community, and we sense that something is deeply, profoundly wrong. But we don't ask the direct question because it feels impolite.
We don't want to overstep.
We don't want to make the dinner party awkward. We don't want to violate the professional norms of the office. So we stay quiet, we maintain the polite surface of the Ouroboros, and the wasteland just keeps spreading around us.
Parsifal believed he was being a good, obedient knight, but he was actually abandoning his internal conscience to appease an external rule. The myth makes it incredibly clear. The wound of the Fisher King doesn't persist solely because he was struck by a spear years ago. It persists because the wound is being unconsciously borne by the community.
It's a shared secret.
Yes, it persists because no one, not even the supposed hero, has been willing to look at it directly, abandon their social armor, and bring the suffering into the full light of attentive inquiry.
So how is the wasteland finally cured?
Well, it takes Parsifal years of wandering in despair, years of bitter regret and agonizing remorse for his failure of empathy. He finally finds his way back to the Grail Castle.
Right.
And this time, he discards the chivalric rulebook.
He throws away the script.
He steps forward, looks directly into the eyes of the suffering king, and asks the simple, terrifying, unshielded question, "What ails you?" And the very act of asking the question heals the king. The waters flow, the crops grow, the land is restored.
Healing only comes when he returns and asks the direct question. Conscience, in the context of the Fisher King, isn't about feeling a sense of moral guilt. It is fundamentally about attention.
Attention as a moral act.
Exactly. It is the radical, unyielding refusal to look away from the wound, regardless of social decorum. Just bearing witness is the cure. But the essay takes us to one final mythic mirror, transitioning from the Grail legend back to the absolute foundation of the Judeo-Christian narrative, the Book of Genesis, the story of Cain.
The story of Cain and Abel is the archetype of the first act of human violence. Cain is consumed by resentment because God favored Abel's sacrifice over his own. Cain's feeling of injustice is entirely real to him. He feels unseen and unvalued.
It's a very human feeling.
Very. But his response to that feeling is catastrophic. He murders his brother.
We all know the outcome, the mark of Cain. But the essay highlights a tiny, easily overlooked detail that happens before the murder. It's a single sentence from God that changes the entire psychological landscape of the story.
It's a pivotal moment.
God sees that Cain is furious and says to him, "Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it."
That warning is the precise manifestation of conscience prior to the act. It is the sudden, terrifying awareness that the ego is standing on a threshold. A choice is about to be made, the stakes are absolute, and the door can still be kept closed.
The animal is literally crouching there.
But Cain refuses the warning. He indulges the resentment. He opens the door. And the crushing bite of remorse that follows, the total alienation from the earth and from God, is the direct, inevitable consequence of having ignored that initial whisper of conscience.
After the murder, Cain expects the ultimate punishment. He expects to be killed by whoever finds him out in the wild, but instead, God marks him. And this mark is fascinating because, applying Newman's terminology, the mark of Cain is the ultimate externalization of conscience.
Just like Oedipus.
Right. Just like Oedipus blinding himself to make his internal reality visible, God places a physical mark on Cain so that his internal guilt is broadcast to the world.
The mark functions as a profound paradox. It is both a crushing burden and an absolute protection. It ensures that Cain will not be murdered in retaliation, but it guarantees that he can never, ever return to the illusion of innocence.
He's branded.
Yes, he cannot undo the taking of a life, and he cannot hide it. He cannot hide it from God, he cannot hide it from society, and crucially, he cannot hide it from himself in the mirror. He is forced to carry the weight of his action, consciously, for the duration of his life.
It is the literal wound that will never close. But the essay makes a breathtaking argument here. This mark, this unundoable wound, isn't just a punishment. It is the violent inauguration of the moral dimension of human existence.
Without that mark, without the heavy, inescapable weight of having done something that cannot be undone, ethics do not exist. There is no concept of personal responsibility. There is no human history as a moral progression.
If he just got away with it.
If Cain simply murdered Abel and walked away without the mark, without the remorse, he would just be an animal operating on instinct. He would remain in the Ouroboros of pure appetite.
A closed loop of violence.
Exactly. Cain's exile, bearing that mark, is the agonizing beginning of civilization's long, slow, bloody education and consequence. The wound forces him to become a moral agent.
Looking at these four myths holistically, the blinded king who gains divine sight, the burned god, and the woman who earns immortality through exile, the barren land healed by breaking polite rules, the marked murderer who inaugurates human ethics, they all point toward a hidden backwards path to finding out who we really are.
It completely inverts our standard model of self-discovery.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which pulls us into the final, profound, conceptual leap of the essay, the apophatic self.
The apophatic tradition, or the via negativa, is a concept originally developed in ancient theology. It is the rigorous practice of approaching the divine entirely through negation.
Understanding God by what God is not.
Right. The underlying logic is that God is so immense, so utterly beyond the limits of human cognition, that any positive description saying God is good or God is powerful is inevitably a reduction. It limits the infinite to human language.
Because our words are too small.
Far too small. Therefore, the only intellectually and spiritually honest way to understand the divine is by stating what God is not. You strip away all attributes until you are left with the blinding reality of the divine essence.
So this raises an important question. How does a mystical theological framework about the incomprehensibility of God map onto the daily, messy psychology of a human being?
This raises an important question indeed. The essay argues that the exact same dynamic operates in the construction of human identity. We are culturally conditioned to believe that we know ourselves through our positive assertions.
We are what we add to ourselves.
Exactly. We build our egos out of our attributes, our degrees, our moral virtues, our capacities, our bank accounts, our successful relationships. We genuinely believe our resume is our identity.
Our LinkedIn profile is our soul.
Yeah, that's exactly how we operate. But the essay argues that the self, much like the divine, cannot be fully known through what it accumulates. We only truly encounter our deepest nature through our limits. We know who we are by exploring the places where we have completely fallen apart, where we have failed disastrously, and where we have been forced to reckon with the shattered pieces of our self-image.
We know ourselves through the negative space. We know ourselves through our wounds. I mean, think about it. Oedipus only understood his true nature after he destroyed his capacity to see the physical world. Psyche found true union only after she destroyed her unconscious perfect paradise. Parsifal became a genuine instrument of healing only after he failed miserably to be present and spent years agonizing over that failure.
And Cain became the first true moral agent, only after he committed the ultimate immoral act and was marked by it forever.
It is an entirely apophatic process. They found their true, enduring shape by carving away everything they mistakenly thought they were, like a sculptor chipping away stone.
This brings the entire discussion full circle, right back to the Ouroboros. If we synthesize this journey, the contrast is absolute. The Ouroboros, the serpent peacefully eating its own tail, is complete.
It's perfect.
It has no gaps, no flaws, no bleeding wounds. But because it is perfectly complete, it is utterly static. It cannot evolve. The self that has been ruptured and awakened by conscience, however, is deeply, painfully incomplete.
It is wounded, it is marked, it is missing pieces, it is leaking.
Yes. But that very not yet, that precise aching state of incompleteness, is the sole engine of consciousness itself. It is the gap that allows for movement. Remorse is the friction that interrupts the self-sufficient loop.
It snaps the snake in half.
It violently breaks the circle, drags us out of the sensory deprivation tank, and pushes us onto an earned upward spiraling path. It forces us toward a wholeness that is not merely given, but is real, conscious, and deeply hard-won.
We have covered an immense psychological and mythic landscape today, but the core thesis of this essay, this deep dive into the Tao of Fred, can essentially be distilled into one hauntingly beautiful thought. Conscience is the wound that refuses to close, and consciousness is what grows around it.
It forces a total reframing of how we view human suffering, guilt, and failure. We spend nearly all of our energy, time, and resources trying to flawlessly heal our psychological wounds. We want to erase the marks of our failures through therapy, distraction, or justification.
We just want it to go away.
We want to rewind the clock and unlight the lamp. We are desperate to get back to the sleeping comfort of the Ouroboros. But the text suggests that some wounds are simply not meant to disappear. They're meant to become our eyes.
They are meant to become eyes. The capacity for true sight isn't about achieving perfect, unblemished vision. It is the hard-won willingness to keep looking at the things that hurt, to look at the mark you carry, to look at the lamp you lit and the damage it caused, to look at the unanswered question you've been avoiding because it felt too impolite or too dangerous to ask.
The ego wants closure. Conscience demands aperture.
Conscience demands aperture. Which leaves me with one final new dimension for you, the listener, to mull over as you carry this into your week. We've spent this time talking about the individual, your ego, your wounds, your conscience. But what happens when we scale this up? If the wound of remorse is the engine of moral consciousness, what does it mean that we are currently building a culture absolutely obsessed with eradicating all psychological friction?
Oh, that's a chilling thought.
If true sight is actually the hard-won willingness to keep looking at our unclosed doors, our unasked questions, and our marks, What is a healed wound in your own life that you might actually be using as an excuse to stop looking deeply at yourself? What if the goal isn't to make the biting stop, but to finally listen to what the bite is trying to teach you? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Tao of Fred. Take this lens, look at the myth you are currently living, and we will catch you next time.